as we cover political parties. In the history of political parties in America, and the third party system, of course, extends from 1860 all the way to the present day. We find, of course, that this system comes about as the Whig Party splinters apart. We found that the Democratic Party, we had those compromises being made between Southern and Northern Democrats. The Northern Democrats, who didn't favor slavery, were willing to continue to put up with it for the preservation of the Union. We find that the Northern Whigs were not willing in the Whig Party to continue to tolerate slavery in any way, shape, or form. And so the Whig Party was slowly splintering as Southern Whigs wanted to preserve the unity of the country and maintain slavery for some time. So those Northern Whigs and the Whigs throughout the country that were rabid abolitionists, they went off on their own and they formed the Free Soil Party, the Know Nothing Party, and eventually the Republican Party. Again, the Republican Party meets for the first time in Jackson, Michigan in 1854. We find that the second meeting of the Republican Party again is in Ripon, Wisconsin, R-I-P-O-N, Ripon, Wisconsin, and we find their first presidential candidate is indeed John C. Fremont. And again, John C. Fremont is the great pathfinder in American history, the person who surveyed major portions of the West and put them on maps which were sent to Washington then for use by future settlers and by our military, by future settlers so they could find their way on the Oregon Trail. And of course, he later played a major role in establishing the state of California and allowing it to gain statehood. Well, we find that the Republicans run John C. Fremont for the presidency in 1856, and their slogan is "Free men, free land, Fremont, vote Republican." Those were the items which were most important. They wanted the abolition of slavery, number one. Number two, they believed that the federal government should distribute land, particularly west of the Mississippi River. If one was willing to go west of the Mississippi, settle on 10 acres and farm it for 5 years, well then it could be given to that particular family. So free men, free land, Fremont, vote Republican. Fremont's opponent, of course, was our only successful presidential candidate from Pennsylvania. And of course, that's James Buchanan. Buchanan is able to prevail over Fremont in the election of 1856. And he serves, of course, just one term in the presidency and then returns to Lancaster. He did forestall the Civil War. There are some people that consider Buchanan, of course, the worst president we ever had because of his term leading to the Civil War. There are other people who are not so harsh on his performance as president because the Civil War did not break out during his term, and he kept the country moving along, even if the question of slavery was not resolved during his time. Well, we find the Republican Party nominates Abraham Lincoln as its candidate in 1860, and we find that the 1860 presidential election is a rematch between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is the Democratic U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois, and in the election of 1858, which was conducted in Illinois for the U.S. Senate, the candidates were the Democrat Stephen Douglas and the Republican Abraham Lincoln. And Stephen Douglas was able to prevail in that election. This is the election in which the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates occurred. I believe we talked about this before. You find that Lincoln and Douglas traveled extensively through the state of Illinois, and they conducted a series of spirited debates, which are still preserved. Today you can buy a copy. In fact, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were just reprinted in the last 2 or 3 years, and you can buy them in book form on Amazon or at one of your bookstores, Barnes and Noble, for example. I've seen it there. It's interesting. Lots of Southerners believed that Lincoln thought that Lincoln wanted to eliminate slavery immediately. That wasn't Lincoln's thought. Lincoln simply wanted to restrict or prevent new states from entering the Union that would be slave states. He wanted to contain slavery and see that it would slowly suffocate itself, slowly die out. We find it's interesting to look at Lincoln's remarks as he travels throughout the state of Illinois. If you take your finger on the southern tip of the state of Illinois and go east-west, you find that you're quite a distance below the Mason-Dixon line. Southern Illinois is essentially the South, and we find when Lincoln was campaigning throughout the state of Illinois, when he was in northern Illinois, he sounded very much like what everyone today expects, very much a very strong abolitionist. But when he was in southern Illinois, he very much muted his criticism of slavery. But there's no doubt that he intended to move eventually, at least to restrict the addition of new states being slave states. So that he wasn't going to see that would happen during his time in office if he was fortunate enough to be elected. Well, he was fortunate enough to be elected, and he traveled to Washington, D.C. on a heavily armed train from Springfield, Illinois, after prevailing over Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas had prevailed over him in the Senate elections in Illinois in 1858, but in their rematch in the presidential election, the Republican Abraham Lincoln was able to prevail over Stephen Douglas. It's an interesting match, to be sure. Stephen Douglas is about 5'4", and Abraham Lincoln is still our tallest president at 6'4". We find that Lincoln, of course, eventually arrives in Washington. The train has to be rerouted around Baltimore because there's civil unrest in Baltimore. Maryland is a border state, and there is a large percentage of its population that favored the continuation of slavery. So Lincoln is spirited into Washington, D.C. Eventually he is inaugurated, and the state of South Carolina, as promised, decides that it will leave the Union. And once South Carolina leaves the Union, shortly thereafter, Alabama, Mississippi, and the remainder of the Confederacy eventually leave as well. We find that, of course, Lincoln is able to persevere throughout the Civil War. Once he finds his general, and the general that he needed to find is a general who wasn't afraid of Robert E. Lee. Remember, Robert E. Lee would have fought for the North or the South. It just depended on how his home state acted. He was a Virginian, and if Virginia had stayed with the North, he would have accepted President Lincoln's offer to command the Army of the Potomac and command the Northern troops. If Virginia seceded, he was going to accept the offer of the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and command the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, Virginia succeeded, and so consequently Robert E. Lee decided to accept the offer of Jefferson Davis. Of course, Lee's generalship at the beginning of the war was quite good, and he was able to um, achieve victory after victory with an inferior level of forces through his tactics and his generalship, specifically against General McClellan. General McClellan was a very well organized commander for the Army of the Potomac, and he cared deeply about his men, so he was reluctant to send them into battle. And finally, his reluctance to combat Robert E. Lee, to wage extended conflict with Robert E. Lee, and his lack of success eventually leads Abraham Lincoln to finally find the general that would be a match for him, and he finds him in the Western Theater. General Ulysses S. Grant, of course, had been one of our leading officers in the Mexican War, and he had gone back to civilian life and then re-entered the military at the beginning of the Civil War. We find that Ulysses S. Grant was commanding the Union troops that were able to seize Vicksburg and split the Confederacy in half with the acquisition of Vicksburg, so that the Union controlled the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in half. So Lincoln brought Ulysses S. Grant to the east, and Grant was willing to latch on to Lee's army and never let go, and eventually simply grind him down. The North has superior manpower. The North had a much larger number of factories and resources so that they could conduct a war of attrition. And that's exactly, of course, what came to pass with the Civil War. We find that as the war ends and Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, we find shortly thereafter, of course, President Lincoln is assassinated in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and the only U.S. senator who stayed in Washington, D.C. and continued to serve in the Congress after the beginning of the Confederacy was Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, and that's why Abraham Lincoln put him on his ticket, removed Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, who was his vice president during his first term, put Andrew Johnson of Tennessee on his ticket in his second run for the presidency. So with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, we now have Andrew Johnson becoming the president. We find that, of course, he steps into the presidency. He is ultimately impeached by the radical Republicans, the Republicans who, after the Civil War, by the way, they're led by Thaddeus Stevens of Lancaster, but you can get a feel for Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans if you watch the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis, the movie Lincoln that came out a few years ago. Tommy Lee Jones plays Thaddeus Stevens and steals the movie. But at any rate, Thaddeus Stevens wanted the southern states to pay for the Civil War, wanted them not to be readmitted quickly or easily, make them pay reparations. Andrew Johnson believed that he was going to carry out Abraham Lincoln's wishes. Abraham Lincoln wanted a magnanimous peace to try to heal the wounds of the country as quickly as possible, and this is what Andrew Johnson proposed to do. Once he embarked on that course of action, you find the radical Republicans impeached him. The trial was held in the U.S. Senate, and he was acquitted by one vote. That senator that acquitted him by one vote is the topic of a chapter in President Kennedy's Profiles of Courage. Find that senator eventually loses his seat, he loses his business, he loses his family, and he ends up dying penniless because he voted to acquit Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson finishes his time in office, and then we have the hero, the savior of the Union, Ulysses S. Grant being elected president 2 times. We find that from 1860 now all the way to 1932, the Republican Party will predominate in national politics. Why? Well, why is because the politics of the nation now are driven by the dynamics of the Civil War. The old Confederacy would become the Solid South for the Democrats, and the North would be almost as solidly Republican, not quite as much. And you would find that the Republicans would predominate during this period of time because the northern states have more states, so they have more representation in the Senate. They have a greater population, so they have more representation in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Electoral College. With more representation in the Electoral College, obviously, they'll have a lock on the White House as well. There are only 2 Democrats who managed to win the White House between 1860 and 1932. And of course, they are, number 1, of course, is Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is the only president we've ever had who did what? He served non-consecutive terms. He was elected, served 4 years as president, returned to private life, and came back to the public arena some years later and won the presidency again. Remarkable politician. And then, of course, later in 1912, we have the Republican Party essentially dividing itself and allowing Woodrow Wilson of Stanton, Virginia, the opportunity to capture the presidency. Let's talk a little bit about the end of the 19th century. You have Ulysses S. Grant serving 2 terms as president. The Republican Party is rolling along. We find Grover Cleveland is able to break the Republican lock on the White House. We find that at some point, U.S. Grant becomes the first president. He retires after 2 terms. He follows Washington's precedent. But later, he falls upon hard times. He looks back at the White House and thinks, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, good address to have. They have fine silver, good crystal, nice linens. This isn't a bad place to live, and maybe I'll be able to get my finances in order. So he seeks the Republican nomination again for the presidency. And the Republican Party follows the precedent set by George Washington, and even the savior of the Union, Ulysses S. Grant, is unable to capture a new nomination for the presidency. And he returns to a private life. Of course, the story of U.S. Grant is he eventually, of course, is diagnosed with throat cancer from perhaps all the cigars and the pipes that he's smoked over the years, cigarettes. But we find that, lo and behold, he decides that in order to try to put his finances right, that he will dictate his memoirs of the Civil War. And he does this, but he is quite ill. He ends up dictating his memoirs of the Civil War for months on end. And when he finally ends, he dies several days later. His memoirs, Grant's memoirs of the Civil War, go on to be the biggest selling book in the country for over the next 100 years, with the exception of the Bible. And you find that who made that possible? An interesting combination. Of all people, it was Mark Twain. Mark Twain published Grant's memoirs of the Civil War, and Mark Twain was able to sell them by hiring former soldiers, Union soldiers, having them put their uniform on and go from door to door, and of course door-to-door book salesmen, door-to-door telling people that General Grant needed their help, and would they please buy his memoirs. And it worked spectacularly. The book was a great success. Mark Twain provided financial security for the Grant family for the next several decades. and as I said, it's still for sale today. Well, at any rate, we go to the election of 1896. We are now in a period of time, remember, the progressive period of time from the 1880s to the 1920s, when the Republican Party is so predominant that it's getting, if you will, fat and happy and a little bit lazy. The Democrats in the North are scurrying to rehabilitate themselves. And one of the things that they're doing that is quite smart is they are at the piers. They're at the docks of the major cities in America. New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco. They're waiting to greet newly arrived immigrants. We had lots of waves of immigrants at this point from China to the West Coast, to San Francisco, for example. In Seattle, we have, on the East Coast, we have a lot of immigration from Mediterranean, primarily Italy, a lot of migration from Ireland through the Irish potato famine and continuation of poor economic conditions in Ireland, and of course Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. And those folks are coming to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and so forth. Well, the Democrats there are greeting them and offering them help, offering them a place to stay, to help them find a job, and help them find immediate food for the family. And all they ask in return is that these newly arrived immigrants, once they become citizens, vote Democratic. This is working. The Democrats are gaining strength. They're getting stronger and stronger and stronger in the North until the election of 1896. But let's stop here for, let's just point out, the fact that at this point in the progressive era, you find the Republican Party is kind of fat and happy, but the Republican Party ends up, the real competition is not with the Democrats in many instances, it's with fellow Republicans. The Republican Party is splitting into the progressives and the stalwarts. The stalwarts are individuals who believe that everything is just fine the way it is. They don't believe any further reform is necessary in the country. On the other hand, they're opposed within the Republican Party by the progressives, or the mugwumps, M-U-G-W-U-M-P-S, the mugwumps. The progressive or the mugwumps believe that reform is necessary in the United States, regardless what the stalwarts think. So the party begins to divide into these two factions as we come into the election of 1896. Well, who did the Democrats propose to run for the presidency in 1896? It looks like they have much increased strength in the North. They might be in a position to win this election. They select William Jennings Bryan. Of course, William Jennings Bryan may have been the best speaker in public life that America's ever seen. We find, of course, we know him today as the lawyer who defended, who was the prosecutor in the Scopes monkey trial. Of course, John Scopes, the biology teacher, who was teaching evolution in the Kentucky school system, and then he was brought to trial for this. And of course, this trial is portrayed in Inherit the Wind, the famous movie with Tracy, I'm forgetting his name now. Tracy, well, it doesn't matter. Inherit the Wind is the movie. It portrays the Scopes monkey trial. William Jennings Bryan was brought in to be the prosecuting attorney, and it's a national sensation. This is long after, however, the election of 1896. But William Jennings Bryan comes to the Democratic Convention in Baltimore to accept the nomination, and he arrives before the assembled delegates, and he said that you will not prosecute us, you will not crucify us on this cross of gold, referring to the strict gold standard that America had. You could take money to the bank and exchange it for a small bag with gold in it, or use the small bag of gold and turn that into the bank for currency. William Jennings Bryan was very aware of the populist sentiment in the West, and he stood for the free coinage of silver. Well, this cross of gold speech is one of the most famous speeches in American politics. And believe it or not, there were very rudimentary recording devices at the time. And the Smithsonian Institution has established a number of years ago a special museum for audio in American history. And what they've done, they've taken that recording of William Jennings Bryan and they've remastered it, they've reprocessed it by computer many times until you can now go on the internet and you can hear the voice of William Jennings Bryan and hear that particular speech. Now, what you have to look out for is the famous line, "You will not crucify us on this cross of gold," is in the last part of the speech. The speech is over an hour long, and you only want to listen to, if you want to hear that climax, you want to listen to the last 10 minutes or so of the speech. But William Jennings Bryan goes on to be the Democratic candidate in 1896. He's for the free coinage of silver. And what does that do? Well, it scares all these immigrants that are arriving in America and are working at, for example, the steel plants around the country. If you are an immigrant, you are living in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or you're living in Pittsburgh, you make what you're paid at the steel mill, and that's it. So if there's free coinage of silver, you're going to have an expansion of the money supply. If you expand the money supply, you're going to have inflation. And if you have inflation, you have workers and the citizens of the country have a lower standard of living. Well, none of the immigrants wanted to have a lower standard of living, so they were alarmed at William Jennings Bryan's call for the free coinage of silver, and they ran into the ranks of the Republican Party for the next generation. The Republican candidate was William McKinley, and we find that William McKinley is bankrolled by some of the major industrial barons of the day, J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, for example, and he's successful in winning this election. Well, he brings on board with him an Assistant Secretary of the Navy by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt would help modernize the U.S. Navy, and under McKinley, we find that McKinley establishes a naval fleet second only to the Royal Navy of Great Britain. And Roosevelt was very proud of this. Of course, during the McKinley administration, we find that there is what we believe today to be an accident. The boiler in the USS Maine, the battleship Maine, explodes while it is anchored in Havana, Cuba, in the middle of the night. Most Americans believe it is espionage, and we are ready to go to war. We are ready to go to war, and particularly because of the yellow journalism that we found at the time. There's been a lot of sensationalism about how the Spanish are treating American passengers on board their steamships and so forth, and how they are behaving in some of their colonial possessions, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. And so we declare war. There's a short war. Of course, Admiral Dewey wraps up this war on the deck of the Olympia, the wonderful, the extraordinary cruiser that you see at Penn's Landing in Philadelphia. Admiral Dewey leads the American fleet to victory in the Battle of Manila Bay. And we acquire through the Spanish-American War, we acquire the Philippines, we acquire Cuba, Puerto Rico and the American Virgin Islands, among other things. Um, you find that Teddy Roosevelt was much like Churchill. He knew that if you wanted to have a very successful political career, it helps to have a military record. So when the war began, Roosevelt resigns his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, runs back to New York State. Along with one other individual, he organizes a special regiment of cavalry. And he is not the Rough Riders. He's not first in command. He's second in command of the Rough Riders. They go to Cuba along with the armed forces, and of course at the Battle of San Juan Hill, Teddy Roosevelt achieves a certain amount of fame as he has several horses shot out from under him as he leads troops up the hill. He returns to New York State, a war hero, and is shortly thereafter elected as governor. He is now perhaps the leader of the progressive wing of the Republican Party. He is the leading mugwump. So as we go into the election of 1900, we find that the stalwarts in the Republican Party are worried about Roosevelt, and they're thinking, where can we put someone so they'll be forgotten, so they'll disappear? Aha, we can put him in the vice presidency. And they ask Teddy Roosevelt to please go and accept the vice presidential nomination of the Republican Party in 1900 for the re-election of William McKinley. Teddy accepts, and of course McKinley and Roosevelt are elected in 1900. But several months into the McKinley administration, we find that President McKinley is at a train station in Buffalo. He is assassinated, and lo and behold, the stalwarts' worst nightmares come true. Now that progressive that they wanted to disappear, Teddy Roosevelt, is now the president. Oh my goodness. So Teddy Roosevelt, of course, goes on to establish the Square Deal. We've talked about that before, and the Square Deal consists of several elements such as reform. You have all the anti-monopoly legislation. You have the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. You have the sort of the bolstering and the expansion of the National Park Service. And you find that Teddy Roosevelt goes and serves out the full term, second term of William McKinley. And in 1904, he's reelected in his own right. And he serves 8 years, but he's only elected once. But he does serve 2 terms, so he steps down just as Washington did, but he handpicks his successor, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft is now his handpicked successor, and he wins the presidency in 1908. We find that after a short period of time, Teddy Roosevelt is very disappointed in William Howard Taft. Taft is a brilliant man. Of course, he's the only president we ever had who would later go on to serve in the United States Supreme Court and be the Chief Justice eventually. And he would like his days. He looked back much more fondly on his days in the Supreme Court than he ever did in the presidency. But you find that William Howard Taft disappoints Teddy. Teddy believes that William Howard Taft, he believed that he was a mugwump, and he turned out to be a stalwart. So in the election of 1912, we have a tremendous surprise. Teddy Roosevelt comes out of retirement and tries to capture the Republican nomination for the president. Now you already have a Republican who's the incumbent and who is holding down the presidency. Teddy Roosevelt wins all the primaries, but the system by which we nominate presidents is very different then. Even though Teddy Roosevelt won all the primaries he entered, he was not able to wrest away the nomination of the Republican Party from William Howard Taft. And this is breaking Taft's heart, because even though he might have been a stalwart in his heart, you find that he adored and he loved and respected Teddy Roosevelt, and he was so crushed when Teddy came out of retirement to run against him in the election of 1912. Taft captures the Republican nomination. Roosevelt can't accept it, and he said, I will run as a progressive. I'll run as the representative of the Progressive Party or as a bull moose. And he renames the Progressive Party the Bull Moose Party, and he's going to run separate candidacy. Of course, the Democratic nominee in this election of 1912 turns out to be Woodrow Wilson. Well, you find that Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft split the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson manages to capture the presidency. Of course, Woodrow Wilson is the only president we've ever had who had what? Who had a PhD. Of course, Wilson is born in Stanton, Virginia, and he goes to Virginia, the University of Virginia, among several other schools. He ends up teaching at Princeton. He's the president of Princeton University. He's the governor of New Jersey. And it's from that position as governor of New Jersey that he runs for the presidency successfully. So Wilson captures the presidency in 1912. We find that in 1916 he is reelected, and he is unable to keep America out of the First World War. Many individuals question if Teddy Roosevelt had just waited to 1916, would the world have been a very different place? Could he have kept America out of the First World War? Could he have stopped the First World War from happening? Remember, Teddy Roosevelt is the first of our presidents to win a Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, for ending the Russian-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War. When it broke out, he immediately brought the two combatants to the negotiating table and settled the war. Would he have been able to prevent the First World War? We'll never know. However, we find that Woodrow Wilson, of course, serves through the First World War, and we find that he serves 2 terms. He is stricken with many ailments at the end of his term as he tries to have the American Congress agree to the League of Nations treaty that he has signed. Find that he finishes his term of office, and the Republicans return to their hegemony with Warren G. Harding winning the presidency. He dies in office, and Calvin Coolidge finishes his term and then is elected on his own. And after that, Herbert Hoover, of course, accedes to the presidency in 1928. So this is all a period of Republican predominance. Well, of course, what happens in 1929 is we have the collapse of the Kreditanstalt Bank in Vienna, Austria. And with that comes the collapse of the international financial system. This is not a depression that is only found in the United States. This is a worldwide depression. And as I said, it really starts in Vienna, in Austria. We find that Herbert Hoover tries to solve this. He's not as successful as, remember Calvin Coolidge, why he was so successful as a president. We find that what did Calvin Coolidge do? Remember, he was the only president we ever had who left office with a smaller budget than he came into office with. But remember, Calvin Coolidge also was facing a possible great economic catastrophe, and it looked like it could become a depression. And what did he do? He cut taxes immediately, and he cut spending immediately. But he had to do those in tandem with one another. He did them successfully, and the economic ship righted itself. We find that Herbert Hoover and FDR were not able to do those things. So we entered into the Great Depression. Find the nation then in 1932 turns to a different political party, the Democrats, and turns to an old political pedigree, however, in Roosevelt. They turn to Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they elect him as President of the United States. This begins a period of democratic hegemony in the country. that lasts from 1932 to 1968. We find that FDR captures the presidency in 1932. He runs again, of course, in 36. He serves his 2 terms, and it's 1940. Will he step down and follow Washington's precedent? Well, the world is on fire, and Roosevelt looks about, and he doesn't believe that there's any other American political leaders that he sees that would be as effective at leading the country as he would be into this war that began in September of 1939. So Roosevelt decides to run for a 3rd term, and he is successful in breaking Washington's precedent. He runs for a 3rd term and he wins. U.S. Grant tried to capture a 3rd term and lost that bid. FDR did not. So FDR wins the presidency in 40, and then again in 44. He wins 4 presidential elections. You find that he guides us through the Great Depression, and of course the Great Depression is ended finally by the Second World War, and FDR is a more than capable leader through the Second World War. It's interesting, he follows the same political path as his cousin. He is Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. He later becomes the governor of New York State, like Teddy Roosevelt did, like his cousin. And then he was a vice presidential candidate, as Teddy was in 1900. You find that in 1928, you find that Woodrow Wilson, that FDR was the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, and then finally as the presidential candidate, and a successful one. So FDR is following the footsteps of Teddy. He dies after being elected for the 4th term. And of course, his vice president, Harry Truman from Missouri, replaces him. The interesting thing, of course, Harry Truman was vice president, but during his time as vice president, he had only had 2 meetings with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt never even told him about the Manhattan Project, which was the project to develop the atomic weapon. So Truman was quite surprised to discover this. However, Truman decides, of course, to use the atomic weapon, and we find that he's able to end the war with Japan, the war with on the Western Front with Germany wrapped up shortly after FDR passed, and Truman ends the war in the Far East, and then of course, he's responsible for the establishment of the Fair Deal. The Fair Deal. The country is worried we're going to pass back into a depression, but we are able to avoid this through the Fair Deal, which we've discussed in class before. Truman serves out FDR's 4th term, runs for his own term in 1948. He is elected, and of course, during this term of office, we find that the conflict in Korea erupts. We've already talked about why the Korean War came to pass, and how how inept Truman believed himself to be in leading that war effort, and so he decides not to run for re-election in 1952. But the Republicans have convinced the savior of the West, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Western forces in the Second World War against Adolf Hitler, Dwight David Eisenhower, of course, had held that position, then was the first NATO commander, the first Supreme Allied Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. After that, he was the president of Columbia University. And at Columbia University, the Republican Party sent emissaries to convince him that in order to preserve two-party democracy in America, he had to lead the Republicans into the 1952 presidential election. Eventually, he accepts that challenge, and of course, as I said in class, all he has to do is say 5 words to win the election, and he says those 5 words: I will go to Korea. And he is elected, and the people trust him to end the war, and indeed within a month's time, he ends the war in Korea. And we find then through the rest of the Eisenhower administration, we have peace and prosperity leading up to the election of John F. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy in 1960. Remember, the election of Eisenhower would have been one of those deviating elections where the minority wins, but it stays the minority, and the majority loses, but they stay in the position of the majority party. In 1960, John F. Kennedy wins the presidency. We find that of course, that he is unfortunately assassinated on November 21st, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. He is actually worried about winning the state of his vice president, his running mate, Lyndon Johnson, in the forthcoming presidential election in '64. That is why he is in Dallas in November of 1963. So we find that he is assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president, of course, accepts the presidential mantle and decides to do what he thought that Kennedy was always going to do. And he decides that he will win the war on poverty and win the war in Vietnam at the same time. We've talked about this quite a bit in class. So we find that, of course, he is very inept in Vietnam, much more inept than Truman was in Korea. And this leads to the reemergence of an old hand at foreign policy, Richard Nixon, who had been the vice president and learned politics and foreign affairs at the knee of Dwight David Eisenhower. So Richard Nixon is the Republican nominee in '68. We find that Lyndon Johnson doesn't run for re-election, but his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, runs as the representative of the Democratic establishment. We find that there is increasing social unrest in America at this time. It's a time of change. And we find that the Republicans develop the Southern strategy. Richard Nixon has this idea that if the Republicans can take the South away from the Democrats, keep the Midwest, keep the Rocky Mountains, and win 2 or 3 industrial states, they will have a permanent lock on the White House through the Electoral College. And that's exactly the strategy that he pursued, and it's still the strategy that the Republicans are using for the most part today. Nixon is able to employ this. He wins the presidency in 1968, of course, and wins in '72. You find that, however, because of his second election in '72 is a massive one. He wins every state in the Union with the exception of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Indeed, there has been a realignment, and the Republicans are now the majority party in the country again, and the Democrats are the minority. However, we find that because of Watergate and Nixon resigning, because of Watergate, and the Democrats are aware of the Southern strategy, so in 1976, what do? They nominate a Southern candidate, the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, to be their candidate. And in that way, they recapture the Southern states during the presidential election of '76, with the exception of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Jimmy Carter wins. This is another example of a deviating election. The minority party wins, but it stays as the minority. So Jimmy Carter wins one term, but in 1980, you have a reassertion of the realignment that occurred in 1968, and the Republican Ronald Reagan has a large victory, which is repeated in 1984. You find that the effects of Watergate have shaken off, and the Republicans are aware of the Democrats' ability to appoint someone from the South. And in fact, they do that again, don't they? They do that again in 1992 with Governor William Jefferson Clinton. They were able to attract Southern support again for themselves with another candidate from the South. We find that the Republicans continue to have the majority all the way up until 2008. In 2008, we have the election of Barack Obama, and some people feel that this is another realignment, and now the Democrats are the majority party. As I said in an earlier lesson, I'm not sure. It seems to point in that direction. However, then the Republicans come back and they capture both houses in the Congress. They continue to control 3/4 of the state legislatures, and eventually in 2016, under Donald Trump, they capture the presidency and both chambers of the Congress. Now they lose the House in 2018, but we're uncertain. Have we seen a realignment or have we not? I think only time will tell, or as we talked about before, we are certainly in a period of de-alignment where neither party will be able to sustain a majority position for a lengthy period of time, that our problems are so complex the two parties are going to simply swap control of the Congress and of the presidency back and forth and back and forth. So that sort of wraps up the history of political parties. Let's take a break here and we'll come back with the remainder of our material on political parties.
That was so long.
I said that. It was.
Jeez.
How long was